Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. This is Edward Ahmed Mitchell, the Deputy Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations, welcoming you to today's episode of CAIR on Air. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope all of you are doing well and staying safe. A special thank you to our listeners on American Muslim 360. We always appreciate your participation. Today, inshallah, we're going to be discussing Hollywood portrayals of Muslims in light of the recent film Dune. We're going to dive into that movie and the book in a bit of detail, and also talk broadly about how portrayals of Muslims in Hollywood have changed over the past few decades, inshallah. We want this especially to be an interactive topic, so if you have any thoughts you want to share, put them in the comments during the program. One question I would ask our audience to consider answering in the comments is, what do you think is the best Hollywood portrayal of Muslims you've seen on film? And also, what's the worst portrayal you've seen on film of Muslims? Could be recent, could be old. If you have a thought, go ahead and put that in the comments during the program today. And we look forward to reading some of your responses during the show, inshallah. With that, I want to bring on our first guest, Brother Ibrahim Hooper, the National Communications Director and co-founder of CAIR. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Ibrahim.
Wa alaikum salam.
So Ibrahim, as you all know, mashallah, has been an engine driving CAIR for decades now, mashallah, and you rarely get to see him in front of the camera, and so we're very happy to have him on to discuss today's topic, which is not only Dune, but also Hollywood portrayals of Muslims. So Ibrahim, let me start broad before we get into Dune, and just ask you generally, going back to, back when CAIR first started, what were some of the issues you faced with Hollywood portrayals of Muslims? And how did CAIR address those back in the day?
Well, the portrayal of Muslims in films was one of the first big issues that CAIR dealt with. We dealt in our early years with movies like True Lies with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Executive Decision, those kinds of movies. And in those days, we tried to have an impact, but what we'd usually end up getting is we'd approach the studio, we'd make a big fuss about it, and then they would put a disclaimer at the end of the movie after they said no animals were injured in the making of this film. And oh, by the way, we're not against Islam and Muslims. So that was the beginning. But we've progressed a lot since there. If people look at the groundbreaking work of a guy like Professor Jack Shaheen, who was the original academic who studied this kind of thing, all the way from Rudolph Valentino and the Sheikh, in the 1920s and the silent films on up, and how Muslims and Arabs particularly were portrayed always negatively, if they were portrayed at all. And so later years, we actually had some successes. For instance, we waged a 2-year campaign to change the narrative of the Sum of All Fears movie. If you know the original Sum of All Fears, it was Middle Eastern terrorists who set off a nuclear device. I believe it was in Baltimore or whatever. And after that 2-year campaign, alhamdulillah, we were able to be successful, and it changed. So it wasn't Middle Eastern. It was like right-wing extremists or something of that nature. Yeah. So that was where we had a real impact. It literally took 2.5 years of lobbying, of letters, of outreach, of all of these kinds of things to change the mind on that. And I think we have progressed a lot since those days. Those raw stereotypes of Arabs and Muslims, I think people would go, okay, that's over the top now. I think just personally, I've seen distinct improvement in not only Hollywood portrayals, but just general pop culture portrayals of Islam and Muslims, whether it's routine portrayals of sisters in hijab, just in random commercials, or the inclusion of Muslim families. And the new there's a new program that's come out where families exchange. It's one of those the real life programs, and one of the families is a Muslim family that changes with I think it's an Asian American family or something like that. So it's the inclusion of Muslims in the overall narrative of the nation that I think is what we're really seeing improvement in. And I mean, I'm a fan of the Dune books from way back when, and I always saw the Islamic references in the Dune books, and it's good that we see them again in this remake.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a transition you've outlined. So you think back, as you said, I mean, even back to like the 80s with Chuck Norris movies fighting Libyans and other Arabs, right? To
Golan Globus Productions.
Right. And then you had executive edition Kurt Russell fighting Muslim terrorists who hijack a plane, True Lies, Arnold's fighting Muslim terrorists. And then The Siege, of course. And there was a huge campaign that CAIR had about the movie The Siege with Denzel Washington. And I remember I saw The Siege with my father and his friend. And my father's a Muslim and his best friend was a Muslim. And I remember they were so disappointed after that movie because, and I remember they said specifically, I thought Denzel was better than that or something like that because Denzel Washington played Malcolm X in what was maybe one of the best portrayals of a Muslim on screen. And then the scene in that movie was quite a transition.
Yeah, my favorite tidbit was the Arab extras in one of these films, and I even forget which one it was. They had them do graffiti. You know how they do it in an urban scene? There'll be graffiti to show this is a Muslim neighborhood, so be afraid. They wrote something like, "This film stereotypes Arabs" in Arabic. So it was
Homeland. It was Homeland, the HBO show, I think, about a white soldier who gets captured and then gets converted to Islam, becomes a secret terrorist or something. Yeah, that was, exactly. So, all right. So that's just a bit of an overview. So I think what you're saying is there's been some progress in terms of inclusion in roles that are not crazy, wild, terrorists. Now, I think one thing we have noted, Ibrahim, is that we've seen, I think you could say, the opposite extreme. That we've seen Hollywood go from sometimes portraying Muslims as crazy terrorists to irreligious, incredibly secular, freeing themselves from the bonds of Islam.
Yeah, that's the other trend.
That's the other extreme.
To be acceptable, you had to get rid of Islam. You had to de-Islamicize yourself somehow. And, I think we're moving beyond that, but it's maybe too early to tell.
Yeah, it's definitely still out there. And sadly, some Muslims are creating TV shows and films that contribute to that image of, letting Hollywood give them a platform to highlight how they are feeling so much more freer without their faith. So we hope we can avoid either of these extremes, either the extreme of religious extremism or irreligious extremism. And so I think the film Dune, as you noted, is very interesting because it could have gone either way. And I think the filmmakers chose a very interesting route. So Ibrahim, stay with us, and we're also going to bring on now our special guest for today's program. Let's bring on Dr. Jörg Matthias Determann and Dr. Amir Hussein, and I'll introduce them both briefly, inshallah. So Dr. Determann, Matthias, is an associate professor of history at the Virginia Commonwealth School of the Arts in Qatar. He also serves as an associate editor of the Review of Middle East Studies. Previously, he worked at the Center for Modern Oriental Studies at Free University in Berlin, at the University of London, and at King Saud University. He was also a visiting scholar at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. His research interests lie in the history of science and scholarship and in the history of the Muslim world. Matthias, assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much for coming.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Thank you, thank you. And Dr. Amir Hussein is the chair and professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University in LA, my hometown, where he teaches courses on religion. His own particular specialty is the study of Islam, focusing on contemporary Muslim societies in North America. His academic degrees are all from the University of Toronto, where he also received a number of awards, including the university's highest award for alumni service. From fall of 2016, he was on a fellowship to the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at USC, the University of Southern California. And then from 2011 to 2015, Dr. Hussein was the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, which, as you all may know, is the premier scholarly journal for the study of religion. He is also currently the vice president of the American Academy for Religion. Dr. Hussein, Dr. Determann, we are honored to have you both with us. Thank you so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Hussein, how are you?
Wa alaikum assalam, Brother Edward. Thank you. It's a real privilege to be on the show with the three of you, and I just want to thank CAIR for all the great work that you do around Islam and Muslims. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Jazakallah khair. So let's dive into this portrayal. So first, Dune. So before we even talk about the movie, Dr. Determann, let me start with you. Tell us about your impressions of the book, some of the history of the use of Islamic history and terminology in the book. Just any perspective you had on the book and what that meant for the author and his take on Muslims.
Thank you so much. To me, as for many other people, Dune is really a masterpiece in world building. It's up there with Lord of the Rings, perhaps with Harry Potter, and a few other works that are of speculative fiction that are masterful in creating an entire universe, but with different peoples, different languages, different logics, and Frank Herbert drew heavily on Islam, on the Middle East, on the Arab world. In preparation for this show, I was just flipping through the terminology of the Imperium at the back of the book, where all kinds of names appear that are either directly from Islam or that are Arabic and either appear as just the original Arabic here or with some slight changes to meaning and maybe spelling. So we have jihad there, obviously. We have taqwa, we have the Mahdi, we have tahaddi, which is an Arabic word for challenge. We have the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. So really a plethora of Arabic and Islamic words that were used by Frank Herbert to build this plausible, very, very rich universe.
Yes, absolutely. And Dr. Hussain, let me go to you. So my understanding is that Frank Herbert was somewhat inspired by I don't know if it was the British or the Russian occupation of, I guess the British occupation of Afghanistan. But I don't know, any aspect of this. So your thoughts on Dune, any thoughts on kind of the substance of why he decided to do this, why he decided to use some of those Islamic terminology and Islamic history in the book?
Yeah, Professor Matthias is absolutely right about the importance of Dune. I mean, that book came out the year that I was born, and as a kid who grew up reading science fiction, this was one of the first times that you saw things from your culture, as a Muslim. Because growing up, I grew up in Canada. If you grew up in Canada and the U.S., 70s and 80s, you really didn't see a lot about Islam. And so this book was marvelous. And I think he was inspired by the history of sort of the anti-colonial kinds of things. You saw the stuff in Algeria, happening in the years before this, the British having been in Afghanistan and not being able to win, and the Afghans being able to, defeat them. And I think that fed into the novel. And as Professor Matthias said, absolutely, I mean, there's such a richness of Arab, Persian. That's one of the things I loved about this. Some of the titles are actually Persian titles. Some of the titles are Arabic titles. The freemen, who are sort of like the heroes in the film, those are the Berbers. And so you've got Berber peoples. So even little things like that, Islam is this religious tradition that transcends ethnicity and culture. And so you've got Berbers, you've got Arabs, you've got Persians, you've got, South Asians, all sorts of folks. And that's there in the novel. I think that was so rich in that novel of reading it. And for the first time as a kid, sort of seeing parts of your own culture, which if you come from a dominant culture, you see that with every book you read. If you come from a minority culture, it's always eye-opening when you see these kinds of things, especially in a world, because you saw the television coverage in the 70s was not positive. Brother Ibrahim has talked about, the movies, but you see on television, the PLO, the terrorists, the gas shortage, all the sort of images of Islam that you saw on TV were negative. So to have this book was just extraordinary.
Now, do you think, to both of you, Dr. Determann, I'll start with you, do you think that the public caught on to what they were reading? Because the film, the book, it seems, was, some people might say it's appropriation, but the book, it seemed, was not trying to portray Muslims negatively. In fact, the people who would be the equivalent of the Muslims were, as you said, the oppressed and ultimately the heroes of the book. And even the potential white savior narrative kind of gets turned on its head, because eventually not to spoil anything, but the main character turns into a despot. So, Dr. Determann, so do you think that...
Not yet.
Not yet. Do you think that people caught on to what they were reading? Do you think that this had any positive impact whatsoever on understandings of Muslim and Islam, or do you think it went over most people's heads as they were reading the book?
Thank you so much. That's a really great question. I would add to what Ibrahim said in his account. It is true that many portrayals by Hollywood of Islam and Muslims were negative during the 20th century. However, there was also a strand of Hollywood portrayal which portrayed Arabs and Muslims as something exotic, as something like the noble savage. There is, of course, Lawrence of Arabia, right? One of the greatest films perhaps ever made, right? That had a more positive portrayal of Arabs and Muslims and Bedouins. There's also a whole Hollywood and broader Western popular culture depiction of the Arabian Nights, the 1001 Nights. So I think actually, yes, the Arabs and Muslims were definitely portrayed in many in negative ways by many works, but not by all. So I think,
but it's interesting. Can I jump in here? It's
sure.
Interesting. The really good movies, The Message, which was a mainstream Hollywood production, Lion of the Desert, which was a well done Hollywood production, you don't see them in circulation. If you notice, these are very popular movies in the Muslim world, and you just don't see them.
Thank you. But I think having watched, let's say, Lawrence of Arabia, and having also been fed like the Hollywood portrayals of the Arabian Nights, 1001 Nights, I think many audiences in the West were ready perhaps for a more positive portrayal of Bedouin culture in particular. So I think the Freemen as this noble people of like desert warrior people, I think this resonated with people to a certain extent who would have watched Lawrence of Arabia or read the book with the 7 Pillars of Wisdom.
Gotcha. Dr. Hussain, what about you? Thoughts on, did it go over people's heads? Do you think they got it, any positive impact? And what were your thoughts? Yeah.
I think a lot of people did get this. And I think that's part of the difference between, film and television on the one hand and books, especially long books like Dune, where you have the time, you have the space to tell the story. And, it goes without saying to our listeners, Muslims have been part of the civilizational history of the world, except we don't see that, in certain ways. And so in the book, it was so powerful. And I think sometimes science fiction, does that, where oftentimes you're talking about issues of the day. I think very clearly he's talking about what's happening in the late 1950s or 1960s when he's writing the book. It's projected out to a future, kind of thing. 20 years ago, Kim Stanley Robinson, another science fiction writer, had this great book called The Years of Rice and Salt. And the premise is basically, what if the Black Death really destroyed most of Europe and Islam was the civilization that sort of, took over the world? And so those kinds of things, that sort of what Matthias was talking about, that speculative fiction, that world building where you create this world, I think that's where in literature, and particularly in science fiction, you have that sense of, here's the history of the world that includes Islam in really powerful ways. And so I think people reading the book, like I as a Muslim reading the book, certainly picked up on the Muslim themes. I think my non-Muslim friends who are reading the book, and Matthias talked about this, he has that sort of appendix at the end where he talks about some of the themes and the terms, the terminology. I think people, that's where they're like, I had no idea. I've heard of baklava. I know that dessert, but that's the only Arab word I know. Here's some other ones.
But
Ibrahim, let me ask you a question. You can also address what you. So Ibrahim, on that point, in terms of the film now, transition from the book to the film, seeing it, right, in reading it are two different things. So I think, in looking at Dune, would you agree that, well, tell us do you think do you think the film watered down any of the Islamic references to the book, or do you think it was still the same? And also, was it easier to catch the similarities by seeing like women wearing what look like hijabs? And tell me about how you think the film handled it.
I mean, it was true pretty well to the previous films. You have the 1980s Dune and you had the made-for-TV Dunes. It was fairly true to that. But to your point of, are you going to recognize Islam in the movie Dune? There was one scene, and I'll try not to give anything away, but where a character dies, and watching it as a Muslim, I'm going, this is just like when Bilal was tortured to give up his faith. And I don't know if you would catch that if you weren't Muslim, but when I looked at it, I go, man, that's just like when he was being tortured and he said, La ilaha illallah, there's no God, even though they're trying to get him to give up his faith. And the same character says, no, I only serve the one, or I forget the exact words, but so maybe if you watch Dune and then study a little about Islam, you'll see more of the connections.
Gotcha. Dr. Determann, to you, what are your thoughts on how the movie handled that? Do you think the movie kind of watered it down, carried it over the same, and not only in terms of the substance of the film, like the names they use, the terminology, but also in terms of the visuals, the appearance of it? Obviously, it's a desert planet. Obviously, you can see some of the women wearing dresses that look very similar to, if not identical to, some Islamic clothing. How do you think the film handled that? Because obviously in Hollywood today, there might be some hesitance to produce a film that is explicitly portraying Muslim-like figures in a positive way. How do you think the film handled this?
Thank you for this great question. I think the film handled it very, very well. Obviously, not all the Arabic and Islamic derived words from the book appear in the movie. The book is far too big, far too thick, and there are just too many words, too much dialogue for all of this to be included in the movie. I mentioned earlier that jihad is a word that appeared originally in the book that I did not hear in the movie. But that is perhaps understandable that the movie in the times that we're living in now, that the film did not want to perhaps be seen as glorifying jihad in any way. However, even though we have perhaps less Arabic vocabulary or Persian vocabulary in the movie, we have so much visual language derived from the Middle East, the Arab world, the Muslim world. You already mentioned the shrouded women. I also caught mashrabiyas, that element of Islamic architecture. I saw a misbah, a prayer bead. I think if you're attuned a little bit to the visual language of Islamic culture, Islamic architecture, you can see a lot of this there.
Dr. Hussain, over to you. And as you're answering that, also, what do you think any similarities between the politics of what their situation are? You've got colonial power, desert planet, rebels, tell us, I guess back in Herbert's day, he's taking some inspiration from Afghanistan there, but even today, I think we can think of all sorts of similarities between that and things happening in the Muslim world. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely, brother. I want to come back to something you talked about. I think part of it is that difference in time. So the book comes out in 1965. The film's released now, and you look at the 60 years basically since then, and there's been that change where now women in hijab are commonplace. Women in hijab aren't the other. In 1960s America, you didn't see women in hijab. Now you do. 1960s America, you didn't see mosques on the landscape in the way you do now. So I think there's been that change in the visual culture because of where we are. But I think you're absolutely right that when Frank Herbert is writing the book, he's writing in the context of the overthrow of colonialism, particularly in Africa, the independence movements that are happening in Algeria, in Libya, Egypt, Sudan, all those kinds of places, and then Afghanistan as well. And I think that's what the film is sort of in reference to. You have this group of people who are basically colonized, who are overthrowing their colonial overlords, who have like this great resource, the spice, the melange, that is what makes space travel possible. It's on their planet, but they don't control it. Someone else does because of the value there. And so I think absolutely it's a metaphor, nowadays for who are the folks who are oppressed, who are the folks that are colonized, who are the folks that, mine the rare metals that we need for our cell phones, that we need for the computer chips, all that kind of stuff. Where's that happening? So I think that the film very much is that sort of allegory around people overthrowing colonial overlords, and very much connected to the Islamic history of that.
Well, that's interesting, right? Because you think the first thing you think when you hear the spice thing is oil, But you made the point that that same framing could apply to other things, like the mining of minerals in Africa and many other places. So sadly, it's perhaps because this is a pattern of conduct, right? That different century, same problem in a different land with a different resource and a different people, perhaps.
Absolutely. I mean, one of my favorite sort of portrayals of Islam on film, not to change the topic, but to come back to that, is a Syriana, and the guy that did Syriana, Stephen Gagin, had done Traffic. And I remember being on a panel with him talking about Syriana, and it was like, oh yeah, this is the same film. Traffic was about, drugs, the where they're produced, the middlemen that sell them, the addicts that use them. Syriana is the same story. It's just about oil. It's exactly the same. Where is it produced? Who are the middlemen that make the money off it? Who are the addicts? Us that need the oil. Where does that all come in? And so telling those kinds of stories, and absolutely, I think in the 60s, this very much was about oil. That's the engine. That's what we need to make things go. In the 21st century, it's all those rare minerals that we never really paid attention to until everyone needed their cell phones. You need to have this and this and this there. And so all of a sudden now that becomes almost like the new oil.
Right, absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned Syriana. So I saw that when I was a teenager, and I remember I didn't like it because it was so depressing. I mean, it was very downer ending. The main character gets blown up out next to the reformer. It was very, not to spoil anything, but it was so depressing. But you're right. I mean, now that I think about it, the editing, the multiple storylines, very much, Traffic. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. And that's one of the films where you have like an actual Muslim, Alexander Siddiq, playing a Muslim role. But precisely, the Matt Damon character talking to him in the film about the way in which people talk about, oh, look at the Saudis, they've had all this great resource, they've squandered it, why don't they do this? And he comes back with some really great rationales, but no, here's what we're doing, here's what we're trying to do. And the moment I try to democratize my country, the moment I try to do certain things, all of a sudden the price of oil changes, and you now pressure me to do things because of that. So really powerful kinds of moments there, in that film.
Yeah. So Ibrahim, let me come to you and ask you, so, what do you think, how do we progress in terms of Muslim representation in film, not just for the sake of representation, but for the sake, hopefully, of changing hearts and minds, inspiring young people? I mean, film has been so influential, not only in America, but around the world. And you can literally see how the change in how people dress in different countries because of exposure to American films. What do you say to Muslims or others who want to improve and enhance the portrayal of Muslims in film and television? What's the next step here?
I was just presenting at a conference in Canada on media representations of Islam and Muslims. And I never go after the media. I say the media is a reflection of the larger society and the culture. If you want to change media portrayals, change the cultural narrative and the cultural and societal perceptions of Islam and Muslims, and the rest will change naturally. And I think that's why we're seeing it change in film, that the larger society is seeing things differently. So they're not going to put up with the Golan Globus productions with Chuck Norris anymore. They're just not going to see them as entertaining. They're going to see them as crass and discriminatory and biased. And I saw reflections of the Palestinian struggle in Dune. There was a lot of talk about occupation and what that does, and successive waves of occupation, whether it's, the one house in Dune or the other, Harkonnen or Atreides or whatever it is, it's still occupation. As they said, that you come and go, but we're still here. And, that I saw, when people start to sympathize more, as they are, with the Palestinian cause, I think you're going to see that reflected in these kinds of things.
Dr. Hussain, I think you wanted to get in on this question. Go ahead.
Absolutely. And Edward, I think this is a wonderful question. And, the American Muslim population is incredibly diverse, a large percentage, folks like you, African Americans, no doubt about their Americanness, no doubt about their long history here. Folks like me, who are more recent immigrants, I came 50 years ago, but that's a whole lot shorter than, 400 years ago with the slave trade. And so when I speak to Muslim audiences, I always say to the parents, especially to the immigrant parents, look, you're not going to like this, because Muslim parents are parents where you have 4 career choices as a kid. You can be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, a business owner, and there is no 5th choice. And I say, look, we have enough doctors and lawyers and engineers. We need more filmmakers. We need more writers. We need more artists. How are we going to change that portrayal? We're going to do it. Once you start having Muslims who are writers, Muslims who are directors, Muslims who are actors, the fact that now you have, Mahershala Ali, 2-time Oscar winners, you can say, what can American Muslims do? They can win Academy Awards. I think Kumail Nanjiani and The Big Sick sort of changed perceptions of Muslims in really interesting kinds of ways. And so I think that's part of it, that we need to be involved. It's really appropriate. And I think that's one of the great things that CAIR does to, critique the media when they make the mistakes they do. The other thing that we have to do, though, is say, okay, what can we offer as an alternative? So we need to be involved in this. We need to tell our stories, because if we don't tell our stories, then other people are all too willing to tell them in their negative kinds of portrayals.
Absolutely. And I think the point there is, for Muslims who, who are upset when they see the 2 extremes, either religious extremism or irreligious extremism on film. Well, again, if you're not letting your kids, who are maybe devout Muslims, they're into Palestine and freedom and justice, well, if you're not letting them be artists, then you're not going to see that. You're only going to see either terrorists on screen or irreligious, overly sexualized, nominal Muslims being portrayed. And so the mainstream members of the community, they've got to be willing to get out there and share their stories and tell their stories in artistic forms. Otherwise,
absolutely. Absolutely, and to take the sort of risk that involves. And so I see this with my Black actor friends or my Latino actor friends, where, do you go and read for Gangbanger number 2 or Drug Dealer number 1? And am I perpetuating this? Well, Drug Dealer number 2 pays $50,000 a year. That'll send my kid to school. So do I do it for that reason? Same thing with Muslims. Are we portraying the fanatical terrorist who, goes out and kills innocent people? Or are we portraying, the drunk who doesn't ever pray or anything like that? No, we need to tell our stories, and I think that's really the key there of having Muslims in the industry, whether it's news, film, television, sports, all those kinds of things. Like, how many people learned about Islam because Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was this amazing, basketball player and a Muslim.
Yeah.
Dr. I hope as well that we can get more Muslims or more people who are interested in Islam and who are sympathetic to Islam and Muslims to get them be involved as creators of science fiction and speculative fiction and futurist art more broadly, because I feel if you're stuck in the realist mode of only making films, making artworks about the 20th century or the 21st century, then maybe the choices are limited, like you described, Amir. Whereas if we encourage the production of works that are set 5,000 years in the future, then a whole universe of possibilities appears about what humanity can look like, what Islam might look like, also what justice, decolonization, inclusion, and so on can really look like. Like futurism, speculative fiction, science fiction offers these worlds of possibilities.
Absolutely. So the last question I'm going to ask you all, I'm going to tell it to you in advance so you have time to think about it, is and this question I asked at the beginning, what do you think is the best and worst portrayal of Muslims on film in Hollywood or globally? But before you answer that, there are a few questions in the comments that I want to get to, and then we'll have the 3 of you answer that question at the very end. So one question from our friend Betsy here says, the film includes Paul's, that's the main character's, trance-like states when he envisions possible futures. It also shows scenes of the desert, patterns of moving sand to mean something. Ibrahim, you want to comment on this? Anything you took from those scenes or meaning from that?
In the scenes in Dune?
Yeah. So I think the commenter here references he would go into trances, have dreams about the future, lots of shots of the desert, patterns of moving sand. Well, anyone, if you have any thoughts you want to share on that. I think we aren't the director, so we can't necessarily interpret what he meant by that. But
I thought the film was amazing, quite frankly. I was ready. I'm a professional critic of all things possibly Islamophobic. And man, I loved the film. Maybe I glossed over things that other people, noticed. Of course, the white savior thing and the Lawrence of Arabia theme and all that. But I kind of liked Lawrence of Arabia when it first came out. But I still quote Abu Tai, from Lawrence of Arabia. It's funny, Anthony Quinn. All these Muslims think Anthony Quinn was Muslim because Lawrence of Arabia, The Message, Lion of the Desert. He was a great Muslim on film, at least. Yeah, I mean, it was a stunning movie. I mean, when you can include a Mongolian throat singing in a movie and with all this other things, you've really made something.
So another question we got is the women in Dune are very strong characters. And in fact, that's where you again see some of the indications of portrayals of Muslims. And by the way, we did have a female panelist we wanted, but didn't work out. So we always usually try to make sure we have more diverse panels. Those of you who watch CAIR and I regularly know. So Dr. Hussain or Dr. Amir, you want to jump in on that in terms of the representation of female characters in Dune?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the person who asked or made the comment, I think, is absolutely dead on. That Muslim women are extraordinary, and we often don't see them, and we often see them subjugated. If they're there, they're in the hijab and silent, that kind of thing. And so to see these strong women is so important there. And I think telling those stories, telling Muslim women's stories is really, really crucial. And in this case, it's Denis Villeneuve is a French Canadian director, so it's really interesting when someone else does that. But I think absolutely that's one of those. Not to get into your other question, but oftentimes those are the negative roles that Muslims have. It's the Muslim woman in Not Without My Daughter. That whole sense of Muslim women are subservient, they're beaten by their husbands, they have no hope until white Americans help them.
I mean, you've got the Bene Gesserit sisterhood controlling the universe practically in the Dune world.
Right.
Go ahead, Dennis. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was very happy to see that all the main women in the movie are seen as strong and very good fighters as well. And I was also very, very happy to see that they represent different skin colors as well, different ethnic origins. So we have definitely some diversity here among the actresses, that we have actresses who are African American or Asian or white, all present and all being strong fighter women here.
And so in the comments, the questioner noted that their point was, if the Freemen are analogous to Muslims, they said the Bene Gesserit they think would be analogous to something else. They don't know what. So interesting thought. We can all put some thought into that. So we're short on time. So and there's one more question. Anyone notice any references to kind of Islamic end of times theories that appeared in the film? So I think someone mentioned, Dr. Determann, you mentioned the Mahdi, correct? I don't know if that word appeared in the film, but that's a concept that appears in the book.
I think it does. I think in the movie it's pronounced Mahdi.
Okay.
Yes, this concept that there would be a savior at the end of time. That is definitely present in the movie.
Yeah, and in so many movies. I mean, everything from The Matrix to, that's a very common thing. Sometimes analogous to Christianity and sometimes to Islam, and obviously overlap there, since Muslims also believe that Jesus will come back one day, God willing. So let's wrap it up with the last question. What do you think of the best portrayal of Muslims on film and the worst? And I'll let you cheat if you want to say more than one for each. I will allow that for the sake of getting some interesting answers here. Ibrahim, I'll go with you first. What do you think? Some of the best, some of the worst?
Well, obviously the ones I've already mentioned as the best: The Message, Lion of the Desert, those kinds of films. And you brought up Not Without My Daughter as the worst. That's one of the worst. Also those made for hate films, the Obsession and what was the one, The Third Jihad or whatever, that they actually made to defame Muslims and Islam.
Those don't even count as movies. Those are just
yeah, well, they're movie length,
yeah.
So maybe they count.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Dr. Determann, what about you? Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Lawrence of Arabia. This new Dune movie, obviously, positive examples for children, and people might disagree strongly with me about this, but as a child, I actually liked Disney's Aladdin. So, I can see Ibrahim shaking his head, but yeah, and in terms of worst portrayals of Muslims, maybe works like American Sniper.
You stole one of mine.
That's a good one or a bad one?
No, it's a bad one. I mean, so American Sniper.
Yeah, that's a bad one. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen that one. Yeah.
Oh, really? I'm surprised we didn't issue a statement about it. That's worse than The Siege, actually. Literally. So, American Sniper. Well, Dr. Determann, you want to tell us a bit about, comment on it a bit? What was problematic about it?
What was problematic about American
Sniper? I mean, yeah, it's obvious if you've seen the movie, but for anyone who hasn't seen it, yeah.
Yeah, I think that Muslims are pretty much targets of the sniper, and deserving targets for the most part as well. I also didn't like that. I mean, the whole setting seemed very, very artificial, to the point of where, like me living here in Doha in Qatar in the Middle East, I didn't sort of get any kind of authentic feel that the movie was actually set in Iraq. For instance, in terms of light, like the light and the colors of Dune are much more authentic when it comes to portraying a desert country, whereas American Sniper did that part wrong as well.
I think it was filmed maybe Texas or Arizona. I mean, American Sniper, I remember watching that, and literally every Iraqi character is evil. I mean, I can't think of one that isn't. So at the beginning of the movie, there's a kid he's about to kill because the mother has given the kid a bomb. And to literally this little kid, I mean, maybe 4 or 5 years old, has got a bomb he's going to throw at the Marines who are invading the country, invading the city. And then the mother goes to help him or something. And the sniper kills both of them. Later in the movie, there's a scene where an Iraqi family welcomes the soldiers in, gives them dinner. It's like, okay, finally, there's going to be a token nice Muslim. Great. Oh, no, turns out they got secret weapons and they're part of the insurgents. So it's like every character was dangerous and hostile, but also there was no nuance, right? I mean, no acknowledgement of the fact that the American soldiers were invading and occupying a country illegally, and therefore people might be upset and might want to resist that occupation. It was just, no, they are cardboard bad guys, all of them. It was very disturbing, and it made a lot of money. Dr. Hussain, let me go to you. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I don't want to talk about the negative ones because there's so many of those, but in terms of positive ones, two very different films. One you might not suspect, Kevin Costner's Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves has Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman, as Azim the Moor, and that thing of, this set in the Crusades. Yeah, there's some Muslims, and guess what? The Muslims were the smart folks, and so that scene with Azim where he's talking about, you take the ones on the right and the left, and they don't know their right from their left, and they don't know the numbers. And he's like, how do we lose this war to you? And so here's Azim, this noble guy. So that one, and then just recently in the last couple of years, Gurinder Chadha, who did Bend It Like Beckham, did this film Blinded by the Light, based on the true story of this Pakistani Muslim guy who grew up loving Bruce Springsteen and wanted to become a writer. And that film, but I love that film because the Islam isn't like 365, 24/7, kind of thing. Because I think that the negative side sometimes becomes, for Muslims, you spend all your time in the masjid, you're spending all your time in salat, and yeah, you pray salat, yes, you go to the masjid, but it's part of what you do, it's not the entirety. And so in that film, it's very much, here's a Pakistani Muslim family that lives like a Pakistani Muslim family. There is an issue in the mosque, there's an Islamophobic incident that happens, but it really is this sense of, here's a Muslim kid who wants to grow up to be an artist, and how do you struggle with your immigrant dad about that? So that film, I think, is a marvelous sort of portrayal, and that's done by someone, Gurinder Chadha, who isn't a Muslim but is a Sikh woman. I think having that same experience of how do you represent a minority cultures in a majority setting.
Absolutely. So for me, mine is going I think the best portrayal I'm going to say is Malcolm X. And the reason I say it is that so many things could have gone wrong with that film. There's so many aspects of his life they could have honed in on one skipped out on the other. There's a common habit of de-Islamicizing some famous Muslim figures, including Muhammad Ali and also Malcolm X. Spike Lee did not shy away from trying to portray him as a whole person, from his days as a young, smart, promising kid to a kid whose life is wrecked by the death of his father, the imprisonment of his mother in a mental institution, to him as a criminal, to him in the Nation of Islam and giving you a wholesome view of the nation, to him rejecting that and embracing mainstream Islam. The film really gave, I think, a very, very, nothing's perfect, but a largely accurate and reliable portrayal of his life. And really those scenes where Malcolm X is on Hajj, where he writes his letter from Mecca, I mean, that is to this day beautiful, where and Denzel Washington recites Surah Fatiha quite well. Those few minutes of that film are just a beautiful advertisement in some ways for Islam, but also an encapsulation of his transition to Islam. So I thought that was a great overall film, because so much could have gone wrong, but they did it very well. Go ahead.
I can't tell you how many people converted to Islam just because of the Malcolm X experience in Mecca and his description of it.
Absolutely.
How
I
he
mean, just
went
like
in
that.
and how he came out.
Yeah, I mean, it's really under talked about. You got the letter from Birmingham jail from Dr. King. That letter from Mecca is, I believe, on par in a different way in terms of impactful statements. In terms of worse, I'm going to cheat a little since we've already talked about films. So I think the TV show 24, you know, when I was a kid watching, I loved 24. It was one of my favorite TV shows, right? But it was only as I got older I said, wait a minute, this is really bad. And so 24 was interesting because it almost had split personality. So if anyone watched the show, the first season, the bad guy was actually a Serbian terrorist who had killed Bosnians, and in the show, the United States had killed his family trying to kill him, and he came back for revenge. So interestingly, the bad guy in the first season of 24 was not a Muslim, but a white Serbian anti-Muslim extremist. Season 2, they skipped to its Muslims, nuclear weapons, all the typical stuff you've heard, secret Muslim terrorist, a white woman who's secretly converted to Islam as a madman, all the bad stuff. And then the show later on got to a point where I did think they did a PSA saying, you know, something nice about Arab Americans because of the backlash. And then one of the seasons, they had the terrorist, actually Alexander Siddig, Dr. Hussain, you mentioned him. He portrayed a reformed terrorist who was actually trying to stop terrorists, stop his own men from conducting a terrorist attack. And I think in the mind of 24, that was progress, portraying a terrorist who had decided to turn on his fellow terrorists. And then finally in season 7, that was when they had literally someone try to frame a Muslim for a terrorist attack. And then they had an imam come in to pray for Jack Bauer when Jack Bauer thought he was dying of an illness or something. This is a Muslim imam came into the hospital bed, and it was almost like a weird kind of meta apology. Jack Bauer apologizing to him. It was almost like he was apologizing to the Muslim community for what they'd done in the betrayal. But then sadly, in the last season, they switched back to Muslims are terrorists. So I think that's probably one of the worst betrayals, even though there were some attempts at doing positive things. And that was a very popular show as well. So I think we all agree progress, though we've seen some progress in portrayals. Still a lot more work to be done. And I think we need Muslims to play a leading role in making that progress. I'll give you 30 seconds for final thoughts from each of you, and then we'll wrap up. Ibrahim, any final thoughts you want to share?
Go see the movie. It's fantastic. And after you see the movie, if you're Muslim, contemplate what you saw. If you're not Muslim, go read some basic text about Islam, and you might understand the movie more.
Dr. Determann.
Thank you. Don't wait for Hollywood to give us the portrayals that we need, right? We have such flourishing and interesting cultural industries across the Arab world and across the Muslim world, including countries such as Iran that have been like heavily demonized in Western mainstream media. But there's so much creative work coming out of there. Look at the science fiction, the speculative fiction in all the different languages of the Muslim world.
Thank you, Dr. Determann. Dr. Hussain, finally to you.
So just beginning with thanks to CAIR for all the great work that you do, you know, in terms of holding people to task when you have those negative images, when you have those negative portrayals. And then the positive side is for us as Muslims, you know, and I can't say this any differently, we need to tell our own stories. If we don't tell our own stories, there's all sorts of people who are all too willing to tell our stories for us in the way that they want them to be told, not in the way that we want them to be told.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ibrahim, Matthias, Dr. Hussain, Amir, thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Fascinating conversation. Thank you to those who commented and asked questions. Inshallah, this is posted live and the recording will stay available if anyone wants to watch it later. And hopefully we can continue these conversations. There's so much we could have talked about, didn't get to. There's a vast knowledge, wealth base that we can get into about this issue. So hope to continue this conversation, inshallah. Thank you all so much, and thank you all for watching. Until next time, assalamu alaikum, stay safe. We'll see you next week for the next episode of CAIR on Air, inshallah. Until then, assalamu alaikum, may peace be upon you.